Hey Nissa, thanks for joining us. We have your Nissa. How do you pronounce your last name?
Fun.
Sun. Nissa Sun here from Force Trajectory Project, and here for the Las Vegas Book Festival. So wanted to get some stuff here and just get into the rhythm of things. So earlier this year, we saw an uprising for a cause that's been present for a long time, but right now is truly at the forefront of things. Specifically with police brutality. Can you speak briefly on the foundation of your organization and its mission?
Sure. So I am the co-founder of the Force Trajectory Project. My partner is Oja Vincent. He is the other co-founder, and we've been doing this work since 2009. We are a media, public relations, and advocacy organization working to uplift those who have been marginalized by the state, by corporate journalism, when they've been directly impacted by police violence. So that's the work that we do. We utilize all kinds of mediums, multimedia journalism, film, photography, illustration, written journalism, and sound design to basically um, uplift the narratives and support those who have been impacted by police violence to construct their own narratives to counter the police narrative that is pumped out in the mainstream media.
Awesome. So, and then when you mentioned what's being pumped out in the mainstream media, one of the questions I wanted to dive into was how is the protesting that we're seeing now differ or compare from the Rodney King beatings and police brutality that we saw in the late 80s and the early 90s? And I'm not saying we only saw it during that time period, but I feel like it was heightened at that sense, especially with the Rodney King case. Um, how are we different from that now than what was before?
Well, I was just a child when Rodney King was beaten and brutalized by police. But and yeah, I do know that there were riots and there were protests, and during that time, there was definitely more of an awareness of police violence because of the Rodney King case, right? Because it was filmed, and that really speaks to the power of independent journalism, right? Civilian journalism to be able to expose the state violence that has been oppressing and assaulting communities of color for, hundreds of years at this point. The difference, I would say, is that obviously we're in a different generation. We have a different set of young people that are being exposed to this kind of violence. And also we have different tools now. We have social media, we have the internet. We didn't have those things when, Rodney King was brutalized. So I would say that the main difference would have to be that because the opportunity that social media allows us is to be able to broadcast from as a private citizen, right, and participate in this ongoing dialogue that exists now on this plane of the the World Wide Web. So I would say that's the main difference.
Of course, so a lot of it is exposure, right? And
Mhm.
how we're able to see um, a lot of these things. Do you feel that since police cameras have been implemented, do you think they've helped, or do you think they've been, or do you think they haven't helped at all?
I mean, I think body cameras are really allowing for us to see more of the police violence. Um, in terms of holding police accountable, I don't really know if it's curbed their behavior really. We've seen a number of, body cam foot, I mean, thousands at this point of people just continuously being brutalized, despite the fact that there's a camera, that the police officers are wearing a body worn camera. Um, and this largely is due to the system and the legislation that protects police. And that's really where we're interested in kind of like building awareness around that, we can protest and the awareness is great, but now we need to mobilize to, get people behind legislation and, work with families who have been impacted to support their struggle for justice.
Got it, got it, got it. Have you personally ever witnessed or been a part of police brutality?
I have, yes. I actually, as a photographer, a photojournalist in New York, I was on my way to see Evo Morales speak, the former president of Bolivia. And I was on my way there and jumped off the stop on the train, and there was a young woman, 16 years old, being pulled, slammed to the ground by a 200-pound officer, very big, I mean, 3 times her size, and just constantly just being shoved onto, like, just taken and just pushed to the ground repeatedly. She ended up having a seizure. She suffered from epilepsy. She was a special needs student. The reason why she was apprehended was because she used her MTA card on the weekend, which as a student, you're regulated to only use it on the weekday for school. So obviously, just being punished for a very minor infraction and brutalized for a very minor infraction. And I happened to have my camera with me because I was on my way to photograph Evo Morales speaking. And so I ended up just pulling out my camera and just taking a bunch of photos of the incident. Her sister was there. It was a very serious situation. I was very nervous because as this officer was brutalizing this woman, I mean, really, she was just a kid. She was only 16 years old. More officers came and started utilizing their baton and just, wielding it around to get the crowd to step back. The crowd was really upset as they were witnessing this. Some of them threw, like their lunch bag at the police. But that didn't stop, the police from continuing to brutalize this young woman. And my photographs were actually submitted to support the family in their lawsuit against NYPD.
Would you say this was one of the main inspirations behind your work?
Um, yes and no. I mean, I've been my main inspiration for doing this work is meeting families who have been impacted by police homicide. That was just one instance of police brutality that I witnessed. I've also seen, NYPD officers wait for high school students of color to come out of class, out of the school building, so that they could just pepper spray them in mass. So I've seen police brutality many times up close, especially in New York City, where everything is there for you to see. But meeting families and working with families is really is the main inspiration behind this work, because it's a very particular kind of struggle that police homicide victims go through, and they also have their own subculture, a network of impacted families, and they share resources and support each other. So it's been upon us to really try to create a bridge between the wider community and the directly impacted population.
Right, right. So during these times, through police brutality and talking about accountability, what what, and I guess this is kind of the real question at hand, right? What is going to make accountability actually accountable? What is going to help end police brutality through accountability?
In my opinion, I really think that police violence needs to be fought locally. It's important for people who really care about human rights to care about it in their own city. Of course, justice for George Floyd, justice for Breonna Taylor. It's so important that these nationally known cases are known, because it creates that awareness, right? It propels people to, think deeper about their own police departments. But we can't stop there, right? We have to get engaged in our local, what our local departments are doing. And, because policing has been rampant across the nation since the beginning of this country, every zip code has cases of police violence. And a lot of them are unknown, right? So it's upon interested and concerned citizens to do that research, which is kind of like a big ask, right? I mean, that's part of the problem, is that, a lot of us care, a lot of us are kind of in and dealing with a lot of our own issues, especially now in the time of COVID. But if we want to solve the issue of police violence, we really need to dig deeper into our own communities and support those who are struggling for justice in our own zip codes.
Great, and this one leads me to my next question here. So, you said, since the foundation of this country, and how we've been policing ourselves, is there a real presence for police in these trying times, or has it been proved, or has it proved to be a failed experiment since the realization of modern policing? What's your thoughts on that?
So the question is, what are my thoughts on policing and the role of policing?
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, the role of policing has never really, you know, changed from its original intent, right? The original intent of policing has always been to control black and brown bodies and to uplift and protect the 1% and protect their property, protect their interests, protect their political careers, etc. To break unions, to not allow the worker to fight for their rights, to gain rights as workers. So policing has always been about oppression, right? It's always been about oppression. It's never really veered from that. There is a large myth that police are crime solvers, but if you look at the numbers in terms of crime effectivity, they might solve 10 to, or I don't even want to say solve because that would be giving them too much credit. I mean, 10 to 20% of all property crimes and violent crimes are closed, whatever that means. Doesn't necessarily mean that they've found the right person or arrested the right person or anything like that. It just means that they resolved the case. And so when we're talking about crime, if that's the primary function of police, well, they're doing a terrible job at it, right? And so that's why it's important for all of us to look deeper and into the history and the roots of policing, which is to uphold a white supremacist system in this country, right? So police are, to a certain extent, problem solvers, but how do they solve the problem, right? Through violence, right? Through force. And so when we call them peace officers, it's always such an oxymoron to me because they are far from being peaceful. And yet we call them peace officers, and they are far from being able to resolve conflict unless, of course, we're considering utilizing force and violence as a problem solver, right?
So right now, with that thought, there's a lot of push and there's a lot of calls for defunding or abolishing the police. Can you explain to me a little bit about what that means and if there's a difference between abolishing and defunding?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I am an abolitionist. I don't believe in prisons or policing. I don't believe that we should have to live in a society where policing and prisons are problem solvers for our issues in society. I think that we can solve problems in more peaceful and more positive ways. But so defunding is kind of like a call to action in the sense of, if we're going to use the word police reform, we have to be very careful because there's a long history of police reform. Police reform has been a thing since probably the 1920s. Where it's like, okay, we have a problem with police. They have too much power, or they're doing this wrong, or they're not as effective as we need them to be. So we need to reform them. And so then there's this whole subculture and ongoing conversation of police reform, where police lobby for more funds, right? Oh, we just need more training, so give us more funding, and then we will solve the problem. But decades after, we don't see any improvements. In fact, what we see is police all of a sudden have way more power than we intended them to have, right? And so that's why defund is such an important word, because defunding the police is calling for the community to pay attention to the idea of police reform. If we want to reform police instead of just outright get rid of them, which obviously is can't get rid of them all of a sudden, not because that's not the right thing to do, but because in order for us to make such a big move like that, the rest of the country would have, right? So that transformation is not going to happen overnight. Well, defunding is part of that step towards abolition, right? It's kind of like, hey, yes, we want police reform in the sense that we want to change how we do policing in this country. And we're not throwing more money at the police. We need to they have too much funding. They have too much power. They don't need the funds that we've allotted them. And we need to take some of those funds and put it back and invest into our communities.
Awesome. Thank you for your response on that. What we're seeing right now in Minneapolis and in other parts of the country too that have decided to essentially either defund or abolish the police, what do you think their next steps are? And I know that's a broad question. You know, we're not policymakers, right? But in the topic of police brutality and abolishing and defunding the police, we've seen it become a thing in places like Minneapolis due to the George Floyd protest, in not only George Floyd but other victims of police brutality. What is the next step for cities like Minneapolis or cities that decide to take that next step to reform their police or abolish it and replace them with something else? Can you explain your thoughts on that?
Sure. I mean, what's happening right now is definitely unprecedented. The fact that I haven't really been up to date with Minneapolis, but I know that they were considering dissolving the police force there. I mean, it's unprecedented what's happening, which is amazing, right? It's an amazing opportunity and opening for community to participate in dialogue around, these real issues that we deal with every day. I mean, let's be real, police respond to all kinds of emergencies, right? And so we, as communities that are concerned, and every community should be concerned about this because emergencies happen every day, every day of the week, and 24/7. We need to figure out how to respond to crisis, right? Without police, we have to figure out and have these conversations, these very important and difficult conversations around first response. Like, how do we respond? Mental health response, right? We have so many people who are suffering from untreated mental illness who become victims of police homicide. It's literally over 52% of all police homicide victims that are suffering from some kind of untreated disability or mental illness. So our most vulnerable are literally getting killed by the police, right? And so we have to have these conversations rather than, I would say, less of that like protest energy, but more of a collaborative energy, right? Where people are sitting down, they're listening with those directly impacted at the forefront of that conversation, right? Because those who are directly impacted they know a whole lot more than we do because they go through it, right? They know that they've experienced to justice because all of them want justice for their loved ones. And so they're going to do everything they can to make sure that they're on that right path to justice. And so in that process, which is why we're called Forced Trajectory Project, it's a forced trajectory for those who are directly impacted. They have no choice. They find that there are a billion barriers to justice, right? It's like nobody's on their side. The DA works with the police already, so they're not going to try to prosecute police. The newspapers corporate journalists already have these pre-existing relationships with the DA and the police. And so typically what happens is they go right to the police for the narrative of what happened. So it's like going to the murderer and his friends and family. What happened here? Oh, that's your story? Okay, I'm going to put that out in the press. In the meantime, they're ignoring the witnesses who saw what happened. They're ignoring family members who have been directly impacted. And so, it's not just one aspect of society that we need to look at, which is policing. We need to look at everything. We have to look at mental health first response. We have to look at mental health services. We have to look at the journalism and how they construct these narratives and how they just pump out these narratives and basically criminalize these victims, right? And so it's like so many aspects of society are responsible for the problem of policing that we have today. So what I would say the next step is to really start having, holding space for these very critical and deep conversations that need to happen in every community.
Absolutely. One of the things that I believe is one of the divisions of how you see police brutality and police in general is if you either support police or you support Black Lives Matter or foundations such as yours, where your the core central of the core center of your organization is to end police brutality, and a lot of people feel, or a lot of people on the other side of the aisle feel that you're pushing police aside. So my question here, really, what I'm getting at is there such a thing as supporting police and Black Lives Matter? Is it possible to still support police and still support the social issues?
Um, that's a tough. I mean, well, I don't want to say it's a tough question, but it's kind of like playing chess and you're on the team of either the black or the white, right? And like, who do
Right.
you support, right?
Hmm.
It doesn't. To me, it's like first we need to understand. We need to educate the community about the roots and the history of policing. I don't think anybody in their right mind would support the police if they knew the true role in the real history of policing, right? Like they are former slave catchers, bounty hunters, buffalo soldiers, the militia that participated in Indian removal, right? Those are police, right? Police that break up unions and oppress workers' rights. Like that's what police, that's their function, right? And so I think what needs to happen is we need to recreate first response, right? And then in terms of Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter movement is extremely crucial because it is a group that has been heavily oppressed for hundreds of years in our society who are crying out and saying, hey, in this white supremacist society, we are being shown time and time again that Black lives do not matter, which is why they're uttering in the streets, Black Lives Matter, right? So I don't think that with this understanding that one person who's saying, yeah, Black Lives Matter, but I'm also in support of good police, that's an uninformed opinion, in my opinion, because you can't really say that you're for the guardians of a white supremacist system and for the uplifting of Black lives, right? The movement for Black lives, right? It's just those are two in contradiction. If policing didn't have its history of anti-Blackness and racism and racist capitalism, then it would be different, right? It's like, oh no, they're primarily crime fighters. They don't have white supremacy as an interest. They're not upholding white supremacy. Then it'd be like, okay, this is a systemic issue, a problem. The system is broken. We need to reform the police so that they are really about protecting and serving. But you see what I'm saying? Like the history and the role of policing, that root has never really been addressed, right? Those who are against Black Lives Matter do not truly understand the role of policing, or they do, and they're just white supremacists. They're just racist.
Got it. Got it. So this leads me to my next question: Is this an issue? The entire, police brutality. Most of
Mm-hmm.
what we see is white officers on the media, right? Most of what we see is white officers using an excessive use of force with minorities, right? Whether black, Hispanic, Asian. That's usually what we see. Now, is this an issue present solely with white officers, or do officers of color also present a problem?
Absolutely. What we say to kind of explain that issue is that all cops are blue, right? When you are a guardian for a white supremacist system, it doesn't matter what color you are, you're still going to brutalize people, right? Quentin Hayward, who's the brother of Nicholas Hayward Jr., who was his older brother, who was killed at the age of 13 in 1994 in the Gowanus houses in Brooklyn, New York. He thinks it's such a ridiculous notion when people say, oh, it's always the white officers and da 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 da, because he was just like, my brother was killed by a black cop. You think that makes a difference to me? You think I'm going to hate black people because the cop that killed my brother was black? No, like it's clear that when you are an officer, you're trained to whatever color you are to be more to criminalize black and brown bodies, right? That's how you're trained. And so it doesn't matter what skin color you are. It's the great metaphor for this would be the slave drivers on a plantation, right? The slave masters, who's the white man who owns the plantation. Well, he didn't always want to do his dirty work. So who would he make do the dirty work? It was the slave driver, who was an enslaved African American who would, whip the slaves, the enslaved Africans when they weren't working hard enough for them, right? And so therein lies that internalized oppression that um, so that is an issue in the black community and when it comes to unity, right? And there's always this ongoing dialogue between black people about oh, the Uncle Toms versus the revolutionary, the Malcolm X's, the people that realize where they're at in history.
Now, here's another tough question here. Under what circumstances can police brutality be justified? And I know it's a very broad question here, but under what circumstances is it okay for a police officer to use an excessive use of force?
Yeah. Hold on just one second. Hey, Nas, I'm in a meeting right now. Can you go somewhere else? But my charger is in here. Oh, can you get your charger? Go ahead. But just be quiet, okay? I'm in an interview, okay? All right. Um, I'm sorry, what was the question?
So, it, I just wanted to get at the use of force for police. At what point can be justified? Now, you can you can use that as it's either excessive use of force or police brutality, depending on your mindset. But if whatever you're seeing, what do you think? At what point is that justified? Should police officers not not even be allowed to use force?
Mm-hmm.
Is my question.
Yeah, that is a tough question. I mean, just like I had mentioned before, we can't really look at only policing in our society, right? We have to look at all the different aspects of society that is part of this, racist capitalism paradigm that we're stuck in, right? And so I'll give a good example. So even here in Las Vegas, since May, we've had at least 3 or 4 police shootings that have resulted in homicide. That I think anyone would consider justified because, those who were being apprehended by the police had weapons and were literally shooting back at the police, right? And so in those cases, it's like, well, as a police officer, you have to defend yourself, right? Self-defense is real. If someone's shooting at you, you're justified to shoot back, right? And so there's been a few cases in the last several months that have happened that way that have resulted in a homicide. And it's almost like, well, we can't really, is that really police brutality? Because they were just shooting to save themselves, right? Because the person that they were apprehending was literally shooting at them, right? And however, if we look deeper into it, these cases were also mental health cases, right? And so because Nevada is a state that's ranking 50th in the nation, nearly last in the nation for providing effective mental health services to our people, that is the reason why these situations happened. I mean, those folks that ended up getting killed by police recently were suffering from untreated mental illness. And if you listen to the families, they will say, we've been trying to get help for our loved one for years, and there's just we don't have the services. There's just no follow-up, there's no support. And so now we're in a situation where our loved one has, in the time of COVID, of course, in intense, we're all dealing with mental health issues now, and they're out on the street and, something triggers them, they get upset, and then all of a sudden they have a weapon and they're shooting at the police, right? And so those kinds of cases really must speak to us in the sense that, hey, this is not just a policing issue. This is a policing issue because the situation, the environment allowed for this kind of interaction to happen, right? We have to look deeper into that and then look at our mental health services and be like, hey, we're also 50th in the nation. So that statistic of 51%, over 51% of police homicide victims suffering from some form of untreated mental illness, that is what we need to address as well, right? So it's really like a holistic situation that we need to pay attention to.
So speaking on mental health, what do you think? How do you deal with the trauma that's caused by police brutality?
How do I personally deal with it, or
I
in
think in
general?
general, from what you've seen in your research and your work, what what are some of the ways that people that experience police brutality deal with the trauma, and how, I guess, how would you explain to somebody that just went through police brutality, um, how would you tell them to deal with the trauma?
Right. I mean, research has shown that homicide survivors are, when you survive a homicide of a loved one, that is probably one of the most traumatic things that you could ever go through, that anybody could ever go through, right? I mean, I guess in comparison would be like if you're a refugee of war, where you're witnessing a lot of murders happen in front of you or loved ones being killed, etc., right? Um, it is definitely, with police homicide specifically, there is no closure, right? Because the state refuses to accept responsibility. They refuse to be liable and accountable. And so, in a civilian murder, not that all civilian murders end up in injustice, right? But there definitely is a more clear pathway for justice in civilian homicide cases, right, in our society. So police homicide victims have to deal with long-term, lifelong trauma of not being able to get closure, of being re-traumatized when they see police, of the details in their cases. Like we have a family here, the mother of Rafael Olivas, her name is Alma Chavez. She witnessed her son being killed by the police, right? And she was even denied as a witness on that scene. Like they basically were like, "You were not there," and she's like, "Yes, I was. I saw the whole thing happen." And she wasn't even interviewed as an eyewitness, right? And so she's constantly being denied of her experience. And so as a survivor, those are the kinds of things that you're dealing with, right? Being denied that you're even a victim, being denied that you're even there, right? So it is an extremely painful, full of grief, full of trauma life. But at the same time, um, there is a very powerful subculture of those directly impacted who, when they come together, it's like this incredibly spiritual and powerful movement of people who have been oppressed, come together and be like, you know what, like we're fighting for the same thing, we feel the same pain, let's go and do this, right? And so what I would tell new families coming into this movement through the horrific experience of police homicide is that you're not alone, right? You're not alone. There's other people that are going through this with you. We do have an impacted community that I can bring you to, and we will embrace you. We will go through your case with you. We will try to support you in any way that we can. And so that's kind of the network we've been building for the last decade, is this nationwide network that I definitely can't take sole responsibility for. It's been the work of so many impacted people who have, someone like Yolanda McNair, who is the president of Protect Our Stolen Treasures up in Detroit, Michigan. She has 1,000 people in her network of directly impacted people, where she keeps in touch, mothers, keeping in touch with mothers, and, other family members keeping in touch with each other and supporting each other, and, calling each other all times of the night to, be an ear, be a shoulder for someone, for a grieving mother. And so that's really what I would tell an impacted person when I first meet them, that, hey, you're not alone. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be very difficult. We're going to be with you every step of the way.
Wonderful, wonderful. So we can wrap things up here as we're getting a little to our time limit here. How can people report police brutality without endangering themselves?
Um, let's see. Well, locally, our civilian review board needs to be rebuilt. It's been sabotaged since the beginning. The people that have been serving on the board have usually been passing and also like ex-law enforcement or handpicked by police. So that's problematic, right? Because in Las Vegas, we currently don't really have an avenue to report police violence. In fact, the director Ramsey Dennison, who created the film What Happened in Vegas, it's a documentary highlighting several cases that have happened here over the last several years. He actually had witnessed police brutality here. And as a filmmaker, he was a video editor for these cop crime shows, right? Like these real life cop shows. So he was always kind of like pro cop in the beginning. But then when he witnessed police violence here in Las Vegas, and he said, "Hey, that's wrong. That's police brutality." He ended up getting brutalized by the same police that was brutalizing this person that he was saying, "Hey, stop." So in his experience, it was unsafe for him to report it, right? Like right there, he's like, "Hey," and then he ends up getting brutalized by police, right? And so our civilian review board is not a good avenue. Obviously, filing a complaint with Metro, I wouldn't say that necessarily would put you in danger, of course, unless that case was like a George Floyd or Eric Garner kind of a case, right? Where it just blew up nationally or something like that. which doesn't happen here often. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that Las Vegas tourism is, like this is a hot spot internationally for tourism. So they really try to like keep those kinds of cases down and not really in national media. Because our own George Floyd would be immediately coming to mind would be Tashi Brown. I mean, his whole killing was filmed on body camera. He died at the Venetian. He wasn't in the middle of committing a crime or anything like that. He wouldn't have been arrested for anything. And that didn't blow up in national media, right? It didn't. It barely blew up locally, you know. So right now, we really don't have I don't want to say a safe way to report police violence. I would say we've been reporting police violence, and that would be one safe way, definitely. We get phone calls from survivors and impacted families. Ever since the killing of George Floyd, it's become even more. We're becoming more well known locally, so people are calling us, and so I would say that's one safe way that our local community can report police violence, because we will work with those people.
Wonderful. And when I'm trying to remember the Tashi Brown case,
Mhm.
was that the one you said it was at the Venetian, right? With the Metro officer, I think it was the headlock one.
Yes, that was
Okay.
it was a chokehold.
So I like that you mentioned that one, because that one was one where the police department, I believe, fired the
Yep.
officer, and I don't know if they pressed charges, but I want to talk about that. I want to talk about what makes that different from, let's say, the George Floyd case or the Jacob Blake case. What makes that one a little different? Where, in the sense, you actually have the sheriff come out and just say that that's disgusting, it's vile, it shouldn't happen. And I feel like we don't see enough of that from other police chiefs when things blow up, right? When things blow up on media. Um, what makes that one a little different? The Tashi Brown case. How is that one different from the Jacob Blake case, or the George Floyd case?
I would say the only difference between Tashi Brown's case and like the case of Eric Garner or George Floyd is that it didn't blow up in national media. You know what I mean? Like, it had it not been, let's say we didn't have body cameras, we
Mhm,
probably wouldn't even know that it happened to him, right? But
mhm,
we had a body camera, so that allowed for us to see what exactly happened to him. And the only reason why Lombardo came out and spoke publicly about it is because he understood the pressure that he was under, right? It's like, it's there for everybody to see. Tashi was clearly have under mental duress. He was, suffering emotionally. He was breaking down. He needed support. He needed help. He reached out to Kenneth LaPera for help, and Kenneth LaPera proceeded to chase him like a criminal. And, he ended up tasing him 7 times, beating him in the head, I don't know, like 20 times or something like that, and then putting him in a chokehold. And it's like, why all this aggressiveness to to address somebody who's having an emotional breakdown? It makes no sense. You know what I mean?
mhm,
So the sheriff did it as a political play, because he knew that, like, he had to do that. He needed to speak at that point, because it was just like, you just killed an innocent man for no reason. There was nothing criminal about what he was doing.
mhm,
Um, and he did get indicted. That was so DA Steve Wolfson did indict him again. Another political move. It was during his reelection season, and
mhm,
so he indicted Kenneth LaPera, and then decided to give it to a grand jury, which he didn't have to do, because DAs have the discretion. They could either go through with the prosecution or give it to a grand jury. Giving it to a grand jury means that he's like, hey, it's out of my hands. It's upon the community, the jury of the grand jury, to decide ultimately, should we prosecute this police officer? And he went ahead and sabotaged his own grand jury by hiring Forest Science Institute, which is an institute of basically law enforcement officers with PhDs
mhm,
who are basically shipped around the country as expert witnesses in these cases. They don't have their record shows that they've never not sided with the police. And he hired them to be a part of this grand jury as expert witnesses, which I'm pretty sure he knew about his record. And so the grand jury decided not to indict, right? And so then he was just like, oh, it's out of my hands. they're saying not to indict, so that's what I have to. Again, he doesn't have to do that. He could be like, as a DA, he has this discretion and authority to be like, you know what, I don't agree with the grand jury decision. I'm going to go ahead and prosecute this officer. But he didn't do that, right? Which only shows that he really is in bed with Metro, because never in his career has he ever indicted an officer. He's literally let like 50 to 100 murders go under his past his desk without any kind of questioning or any mention of prosecution.
So in other words, they got a little lucky, the fact that it didn't blow up in the national media, and
Exactly.
they were able to brush it under the rug, um,
Exactly.
through their own people.
That's
So
exactly right.
that's why we didn't hear enough of it. Right.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Well, this has been a wonderful talk, Nissa. Thank you so much for your time. Very informative. Want
Sure.
to thank you on behalf of the City of Los Angeles, Office of Cultural Affairs, and the Las Vegas Book Festival. This is our virtual week, our first time doing so.
That's
If you want
great.
to say anything or let folks know where they can reach you, um,
Sure.
your website, you can go ahead.
Actually, I wanted to ask you, since this is the book festival, and we were brought to this through the Stolen Lives Project book. Did you want me to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Okay. So, the book that we're talking about is the Stolen Lives Project book, which unfortunately is out of print. Um, there are boxes of these books in New York in several people's apartments.
Mhm.
Plots probably. So at some point, it would be great if I could get access to them and start just shipping them out to people. But basically, the Stolen Lives Project, which I was not a part of personally, it was our mentor, Monica Shea, the late Monica Shea. She spearheaded the Stolen Lives Project back in the mid 90s. And the Stolen Lives Project was basically an archival project that documented police killings all across the nation. And they've probably documented 6,000 police brutality cases over several decades, right?
Mhm.
She started this project, or she spearheaded it, with the National Lawyers Guild, October 22nd Coalition, and the Anthony Baez Foundation. Anthony Baez being the son of Iris Baez, who was killed in December of 1994 in a chokehold by the NYPD. Um, she started this project with them because there was this awareness of an epidemic of police violence, right? That it was happening extremely frequently, and that it was not being documented by any governing bodies, right? So we have FBI uniform crime statistics through the Bureau of Justice, Bureau of Justice Statistics, I think, Bureau, something like that. And they don't really do a good job at taking data. They basically count justifiable homicides that are reported by voluntarily by police departments across the nation, and their average number of killings per year is 400 to 600. We know from civilian databases that that's just not the case, right? And so what ends up happening, because the government is horrible at actually documenting these cases, civilian databases started popping up, and the Stolen Lives Project is actually the first civilian database of police killings. Started in the mid 90s. The other civilian databases didn't really start until like 2010, 2011. So there's killedbypolice.net, there's mappingpoliceviolence.org, there is Killed by Police, what else? Fatalencounters.org, and then the Guardian started counting, and also the Washington Post started counting as well. So in all of this, right, the fact that there's no governing body documenting the Stolen Lives Project is extremely unique, in the sense that it is the first civilian database that started in the 90s, so way earlier than these other civilian databases. And so Monica Shea, who was the Dean of Arts and Sciences at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, she would employ her students, her college students, and give them credit for going to the library and going through microfiche and old newspaper clippings and magazines to document these killings. And so, that's how the Stolen Lives Project came to be, and that's how it continued. When myself and Oja, my partner, came to the October 22nd Coalition around 2009, 2010, and joined the group, which is, October 22nd is the longest running anti-police brutality coalition in the nation. She gave us our blessing, because we basically told her, we're media makers, and we love the Stolen Lives Project, but it's a little dry when you look at it, right? It's kind of like, okay, here's states, like they're categorized by state, and then you see some stories have like a name and maybe some demographics, race, age, and then maybe a paragraph or two. Some of them don't even have any paragraphs. Some of them are just the age and the name and the race, and that's it, right? In the city they were killed. Um, it's kind of like a researcher's tool, but it's not really digestible to the public, right? And so we created the Force Trajectory Project because we wanted to start illustrating these stories, right? Utilizing multimedia to really get these stories out and get people to really absorb them and understand them and digest them and be like, hey, this is happening on a regular basis. And we need to pay attention because anybody could be next. And so that's how the Force Trajectory Project came to be. We got the blessing from Monica Shea. Unfortunately, about a year later, she was murdered in her home in a mass murder on her family. Very, very sad situation. And with her passing away, that really disrupted the work that she was doing, right? The Stolen Lives Project kind of came to a halt. October 22nd fell apart. October 22nd was largely an organizing space for impacted families, veteran family activists in New York and around the nation. And because that organizing space was destroyed because of Monica's absence and her sudden death, I helped Oja and I helped Cynthia Howell, the late Cynthia Howell, she passed as well, create Families United for Justice, which is a nationwide organization, a coalition of impacted families coming together to build collective power and create systemic change. And so we have a chapter here, Families United for Justice Las Vegas, here locally, and which I started in 2016. During the time that when we first came here, there were no active cases. There were no active families who were protesting, who were, out there voicing, trying to get justice for their loved ones. And since we have been here for, now 5 years, 4 or 5 years, we now have and represent over 20 cases of police homicide and police brutality.
Wonderful.
So,
well, thank you so much, Nissa. Truly wonderful work, highlighting hope in some dark times right now. So we truly appreciate you, and thank you again for being a part of this.
Sure. I can also give my the website details and everything. So
Please.
to witness our work, our work is largely for display on the internet. Forcedtrajectory.com is our website. We have all kinds of things on there. We have a story archive. We have panels and presentations, lots of journalism, lots of photos, all kinds of videos. So, please check that out. You could spend hours on that site and still not get through the surface. So lots to digest on that website. Our Facebook is Forced Trajectory Project. Our Instagram is Forced Trajectory, and our Twitter is FTPRO Media.
Wonderful. Nissa, thank you again. And like I said, on behalf of everyone here at the City of Las Vegas, a much deep heartfelt to you and your organization for your time. And we look forward to working together again.
So, great. Thank you, Jonathan.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
All right. You too.